Hi everyone, and welcome to State of the Medomak. My name is Isabel Curtis, and I'm the Stewardship Director here at Midcoast Conservancy. We are a regional land trust in the Midcoast Maine area, and we protect and restore vital lands and waters on a scale that matters. So I'm going to be talking to you today about forest ecology, then I will pass it off to Morgan, who will explain what a watershed is, some of our estuary monitoring work, upcoming land conservation projects, stewardship efforts to care for conserved lands, and how you can support us. So, back to the woods. So Maine's forests are really interesting and really unique, and they are actually globally important. So Maine's forests are part of one of the largest intact temperate forests in the world. And Maine is also the most forested state in the US, with about 89% forest cover, which is huge. And Maine's forests are very biodiverse. So, what is biodiversity? On the left, you have a cornfield, one species, low biodiversity. On the right, a wildflower meadow with many species and high biodiversity. So you can think of biodiversity simply as the measure of the number of species within one area and their relative proportion to each other. So back to the Medomak watershed, because that's what we are here to talk about today. I'm going to explain 3 reasons that make this particular area important and unique. One of those reasons is its unique topography. So you're probably all familiar with Maine's iconic jagged coastline. And part of that is due to a tectonic plate collision millions of years ago, and its more recent glacial history. So about 12,000 years ago, Maine was completely covered in ice by the Laurentide Glacier. And as that glacier receded, it scraped and carved the land and made a lot of the roughly north-south oriented ridges and valleys that we see that form many of the peninsulas and tidal inlets and islands of the iconic Maine coast. And as those glaciers were melting, the meltwater also carried sediment to the foot of the glacier where it deposited it in moraines, which are basically piles of gravel and sand. And as the glacier continued to recede, it made parallel series of moraines. And the moraines in the Waldoboro area stand out globally. And you can see them on the right here. They appear almost as ripples across the landscape. And so we have the tectonic plate activity and the glacial activity creating large effects on the topography. And then you also have these microclimates created by the glacial moraines. And all of this physical diversity translates to biological diversity, right? Because the species that can grow on the high and dry granite ridges are going to be very different than the species that grow in the lower and wetter valleys. The second factor I want to talk about is the ocean's influence. So Midcoast Maine and coastal Maine in general is actually in a different climate division than the interior and northern areas of Maine. And that's because the ocean temperature fluctuates much less than the air and land temperatures. So in the Midcoast Maine area, the ocean really only fluctuates on average about 20 degrees, from about 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And what this does is in the summer, that cold ocean water keeps the coastal areas cooler than the interior. And in the winter, the relatively warmer ocean water keeps coastal areas warmer with less extreme low temperatures than inland areas. And there's another fun coastal dynamic, the coastal fog. So we've probably all been socked in before with the dense, impenetrable blanket of fog, and you can't even see 50 feet in front of you. So this phenomenon happens when the warm air in the summer passes over the colder ocean water, and water droplets condensate, forming fog. And what this does is it keeps the coastal areas in a very narrow band along the coast much cooler and moister than interior areas. So the third and last thing I want to talk about, which is really, really interesting, is that Maine exists at the convergence of two major plant biomes. So a biome is just a large geographical area that shares similar climatic conditions. So think rainfall, temperature, they exist at a similar latitude. And because of these shared climatic conditions, they have similar assemblages of species. And they're very large areas. So the whole world has only about 8 major terrestrial plant biomes. And Maine is at the convergence of the northern boreal biome, which covers much of Canada and is characterized by a lot of spruce and fir and moss. It tends to be cool and moist. And the temperate deciduous biome, which covers much of the east coast of the United States. And that is characterized by broadleaf deciduous trees such as maple and oak that lose their leaves in the fall. It also has a lot of pine species, and it tends to be much warmer and drier than the boreal biome. And here in Midcoast Maine, we exist right at the transition zone between these two biomes. And so because of that, there are many species that reach their northern or southern range limit within Maine. So the boreal species, such as spruce and fir, reach the farthest southern extent that they're able to grow in Maine. So beyond that, it is too warm and dry for them. Similarly, a lot of the southern temperate species reach their northern limit in Maine, meaning beyond that, it's too cold for them to grow. And about half of the woody plant species that occur in Maine reach their northern or southern limit here, which is a huge percentage. And where those species ranges end actually can be aggregated in two fairly narrow bands throughout the state, which is what you see here on the right. That is a map showing all of the range limits of the woody plant species in Maine. And so the light green lines show the southern transition zone, and dark green show the northern transition zone. So here in Midcoast Maine, we exist within this southern transition zone, which is where 28% of all woody plant species in Maine reach their northern or southern limit. And because of its location between the temperate southwest, the mountains, and down east, central coastal Maine is the nexus of the ecological transition in Maine. As a result of the combining northern and southern elements, this coastal area sustains the most woody plant species in Maine. So again, it has a very high number of species occurring here, so it's very biodiverse. And here in this image, you can see some coniferous species in the valley, the evergreens, next to some oak and other deciduous temperate species growing on the drier hillside. And here in the Medomak watershed, you can experience this biodiversity by taking a hike at Martin Point Trail in Friendship, where it really feels like the boreal forest. It's dominated by spruce and fir. The ground is carpeted in moss. It's often blanketed in fog. And then if you travel just 12 miles north to Burkett Mill Trail in Waldoboro, you will find a stand of pitch pine, which is a southern temperate species. It really occurs mostly in the New Jersey pine barrens and Cape Cod, and it kind of reaches its northern extent here in Maine. And, you know, this is pretty remarkable that they are growing within 12 miles of each other. So, because Maine and the Midcoast area in particular exists at this transition zone between southern temperate species and northern boreal species, it also means we are primed for change and instability. So generally what we expect to see is that as winters warm, species will push their range limits north. So boreal species, it'll become too warm and dry for them, and they'll get pushed farther north along the coast. And those southern temperate species will expand their range as it gets warmer. And so something we think a lot about here at Midcoast Conservancy is how do we make our ecosystems the most resilient that they can be to be able to adapt to these changing conditions. And so one of the biggest things we can do is keep landscapes connected. So make sure that blocks of undeveloped forest stay connected so species can move across the landscape. We also want to make sure that we are conserving and protecting a high diversity of habitat types, and that we are also protecting our waterways and wetlands, as these are very ecologically significant areas. So, as residents of an area that is so primed for change, we can all take part in this effort to ensure it thrives for generations to come. And now I'm going to pass it off to Morgan.
Awesome, Isabel. Thank you for that great introduction to the local forest ecology of this very special place. My name is Morgan, and I am the Medomak Regional Stewardship Manager here for Midcoast Conservancy. I can often be found with my shadow, Kraken, my border collie. I grew up right here in Waldoboro. This place is really special to me. And in 2022, I started working for Midcoast Conservancy. And this is truly my dream job. The fact that I get to work here in this area, my homelands, and help protect these lands and waters and connect with you, amazing community, is just the best. I really am so grateful that I get to be here and do this. So, some framework for the talk. Isabel took us through the forest ecology of the area. I'm going to talk about what a watershed is, the estuary monitoring program that we're doing here in the Medomak, land conservation projects, stewardship, so how we care for our lands, and then community support, how you guys can help the watershed and also help support Midcoast Conservancy. So, who cares? Why are we here? And that's because we all live in a watershed. No matter where you are in a watershed, whether that's here in the Medomak or a neighboring place like the St. George, the Sheepscot, or the Damariscotta. And ecological health directly ties into community health. We have a lot of farmland and working waterfront here in the Medomak, and that allows us access to a lot of incredible local natural resources. And we want to keep this watershed healthy so that people in future generations can still have access to these amazing places that we love so much. So what is a watershed? This is a question I get asked a lot. A watershed is just the area of land that channels all rainfall, snowmelt, and runoff into a single point. And the single point that we're talking about today is the Medomak River. And each little tributary, so that's a smaller stream that goes into the bigger river, each little tributary contributes to the quantity and quality of a river downstream. So this is an extremely connected ecosystem. Everything that's happening above, upstream from us, affects us down here. And everything we do affects people downstream and communities, wildlife, fish downstream as well. So hopefully after this talk, we can understand the role of the watershed in our lives and our role in its life, and work together, be inspired to work together to maintain these resources so that people can use them for future generations. The Medomak, it's Wabanaki for place of many alewives. And if any of you have been out at the falls in May or June, you can see the plethora of fish making their way up. So it's a pretty fitting name. The Medomak River goes through 13 towns, so there's a lot of communities that are impacted by this watershed. A little bit of an anatomy of a watershed. So it starts at its headwaters. And here the Medomak starts a little bit in Liberty and Steersmont and Appleton. That's where Fishbrook and Pettingill streams start. And then in Washington, you have Washington Pond and the Little Medomak. So Fishbrook, Pettingill Stream, and the Little Medomak all come together to form the main stem of the river, which flows through the towns of Washington, Union, and Waldoboro until it reaches the head of tide. The head of tide is where there's the furthest influence of tidal activity, so from the ocean. And in the town of Waldoboro, it's just north of the Main Street Bridge. So if you head on that bridge and look to the right, you will see these falls. And the head of tide in the Medomak is kind of unique, where it's this very stark, definitive head of tide. So the falls or the high tide almost never go above those falls. So you have areas that are very different. So freshwater and then salty water existing right next door to each other with this very definitive line, which is kind of unique for a watershed. The water then continues from the head of tide into the estuary. This goes from about that head of tide here in Waldoboro to the Narrows near Jones Neck. And this is a mixing area. There's a lot of influence from freshwater as well as ocean influence. And these estuaries are really important habitat and nursery for a lot of our harvested species. So like the lobsters, clams, American eels, etc. And these areas are really important because they provide a transitional zone for fish like alewives or the American eel as they transition from their saltwater habitat to their freshwater habitat. And then we head out into the open ocean. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the work that Midcoast Conservancy is doing in our estuary because it is so important. And that is that we are part of the Maine Coastal Observing Alliance, or MCOA for short. MCOA was started in 2014, so this is our 12th year of collecting data, and it involves a lot of people working together. So you have conservation organizations like Midcoast Conservancy, municipalities, community members like yourself, and state scientists all working together, and university professors all working together to help collect a unified data set from Casco Bay to Belfast throughout the summer months. And the data we collect is water clarity, so how clear the water is, total nitrogen, which can indicate different nutrient inputs into the water, the pH, so how acidic or basic the water is, dissolved oxygen, because even though fish live underwater, they still need oxygen to survive. So this measures how much oxygen is available in the water to them. Temperature, how warm or cold the water is, and then salinity, so how salty the water is. And because this is an area with both freshwater inputs and ocean inputs, the salinity can vary. We also just use observation. So what are we seeing while we're out there? One thing we look at is how many lobster buoys are around. The lobstermen, they know where the fish are. They know where the lobsters are. So if we see an area with a lot of lobster buoys, we can maybe assume that there's probably a lot of life on the bottom of the ocean there. And on the flip side, if we see an area that usually has a lot of lobster buoys, but now there aren't any, that can indicate maybe an area with less life. And then another thing that I've noticed while I was out there this summer were a lot of porpoises. So I don't know if you guys know, but Maine has these little porpoises. They're like little dolphins. They're so cute. It's always really fun to get to see them out there. And this year I saw them almost every single trip up through mid-August that I was out there. And usually I only see them like once or twice a year. So not sure what it means, but I did see more porpoises than usual. Another big change that we observed this year was the jellyfish bloom. I don't know if you guys have heard, but in 2025, the early summer, we had a lot of jellyfish on the Maine beaches here. So I'm going to take a little bit of a dive into explaining why some scientists think this might have happened this year. So the two jellyfish that we have here in Maine are the moon jelly and the lion's mane jellyfish. The moon jelly are very common. We often will see them when we're out there on any given year, just not in as many, not as high numbers as we saw this year. But they're smaller, just a couple inches in diameter. They're completely see-through. And a really good way to identify these guys is you'll see these four little horseshoes on their belt. And they lack long stinging tentacles, so they're not really going to sting us. So you don't really have to worry about the moon jellies. On the flip side, we have the lion's mane jellyfish. These are some of the largest jellyfish in the world. They can range anywhere from like 2 feet to 10 feet in diameter. They're Arctic cold water species, so mostly they're found up in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And these guys have very long tentacles, anywhere from like 10 to 100 feet long. And these tentacles can sting you. So if you see a lion's mane jellyfish when you're at the beach, don't go in the water. So some general jellyfish ecology. So on the right here, I have their life cycle. So they start out as a little egg, then they settle down onto the bottom and attach to the bottom floor and become more like a sea anemone. That sea anemone or polyp releases little baby jellyfish. They grow into the adult form that we're used to seeing, and the cycle continues. These jellyfish, they don't really decide where to go necessarily. They're mostly following ocean currents, but they can just like understand if they're in a happy habitat for them or maybe a less desirable habitat. They are a natural part of our ecosystem, and their cycles do fluctuate. So even though we saw a bloom this year, and it was a lot of jellyfish, they do tend to cycle in different amounts, different years. Two species that were probably really happy about this jellyfish bloom were the mola mola sunfish, which is the world's largest bony fish. They're this really cool, funky looking gray blob with this fin up top and fin below. Often if you're out in the water and you see this like classic Jaws looking shark fin coming through the water, don't worry, it's probably just a Waldoboro sunfish. We also have leatherback sea turtles here in Maine, which is really cool. And the sea turtles and the Waldoboro sunfish love to eat jellyfish. So to understand why some scientists think that we had this extra special bloom this year is understanding the Gulf of Maine. So we are in a basin, and so that traps a lot of water here and creates a very unique ecology. So I'm going to zoom out. Here is the eastern seaboard. You have Nova Scotia and Newfoundland up in top and Florida down on the bottom. This map shows colder water in blue, warmer water in orange and yellow, and then green is the mixing zone. So you can see that the Gulf of Maine has a lot of green in it. It's a mixing zone. And that's because we have the cold Labrador Current bringing in cold water from the north. And then you have the Gulf Stream bringing warm water from the south. And then this is where they mix. And as you can see, like I said, the Gulf of Maine is green, so another mixing zone. So like what Isabel was talking about during her discussion, this is an area of transition, a meeting zone of northern colder species and climates and warmer southern species. And like Isabel said, where you have that meeting zone, you have a lot of transitions, and a diverse physical habitat creates also high biological diversity. Zooming back into the Gulf of Maine, here you see the cold water, the Labrador Current coming in from the north, the warm Gulf Stream coming in from the south, and something happened in 2025 that has never happened in recorded history. And that is a very large portion of the Arctic sea ice did not freeze this year. It was a pretty large area, almost the size of California. So since that area didn't freeze, it was a little bit warmer than normal this year. The lion's mane jellyfish, who prefer the cold Arctic temperatures, it was too warm for them up there, so they caught the Labrador Current down here. And they made their way into the Gulf of Maine. Now, this was happening in around May and June, where while we do have the cold water coming in from the Labrador Current, it's also springtime and transitioning into summer, where usually those warmer water, the temperatures of the water are warming. However, if you guys remember back in May and early June this year, we had a lot of cloud cover. So it was a very cold, rainy spring. And so this helped to keep the sun rays off of the Gulf of Maine and allow the temperatures to stay cooler, which then allowed for these really cold, nutrient-rich waters to be existing in the Gulf of Maine and along the coast of Maine. And this allowed for the jellyfish to thrive. So they caught that cold water current. The cloud cover kept our temperatures colder for longer, ideal conditions for these jellyfish. And just like Isabel said, when you're at that transition zone, the meeting of extremes, it can create more diversity, but can also make it more susceptible to these changes. And so one of the best ways that we can help our waterways be resilient through this climate change is to conserve the land surrounding these water bodies. So here in red on this map, we have Midcoast Conservancy's service area outlined in red, and we focus on 3 different watersheds within our service area. So you have the Sheepskate watershed in green, Damariscotta Lake in orange, and the Medomak in blue. And we're just going to focus on the Medomak for this talk. It's around 100,000 acre watershed, 30 miles from the top at their headwaters down to that head of tide, and then about 8 miles of estuary. And there are many, many tributaries that are feeding into the main stem of the Medomak River. One of those tributaries is Pettingill Stream. It's one of the headwaters of the Medomak, so where it actually starts. We're going to zoom in here to Pettingill Stream. So it's about a 6,000 acre watershed with 7 miles worth of stream. It's a little bit in the town of Steersmont, mostly Appleton and Union. And a really cool part about the Pettingill Stream is that it starts in the Appleton Bog focus area. This is an amazing area that's one of Mid-Coast Maine's largest and most ecologically diverse watersheds. So it's a complex of 3 different watersheds. You have the 3 different swamps. So you have the Appleton Bog, Witcher Swamp, and Pettingill Swamp all coexisting together to create this incredible, unique ecological system. It's a little bit in the towns of Searsmont and Montville, mostly in Appleton though. And this is where the Medomak River and the St. George River start. So they share the same headwater area, which is really a fun fact because so they share the same headwater area, then the rivers go do their own things, and then they rejoin together in Muscongas Bay. So there's kind of like these 2 little sister watersheds, which I always think is really nice. And as Isabel mentioned in her talk, we're at the northern terminus of a lot of southern species, and one of those is the Atlantic white cedar and a habitat called a cedar swamp. In the Appleton Bog focus area is one of the largest cedar swamps in Maine, and it's also one of the most northern. Another really important habitat type that is found here is called an unpatterned fen. And a fen is just like a swamp, but it's fed by groundwater that's really nutrient rich. And so because there's so many nutrients there, it allows for a high biodiversity of plant life. So sounds like a really cool area, right? Worth protecting? And it is. So the state of Maine has recognized this area as a focus area of statewide ecological significance. And even at the federal level, the National Park Service has recognized this as a national natural landmark. But most of the conservation work being done in this area is by local on-the-ground organizations like Midcoast Conservancy, as well as the Nature Conservancy here in dark maroon. The purple is Maine Farmland Trust, and the pink is Georges River Land Trust, as well as you can see a little green area. That's an easement Midcoast Conservancy has in the area. But what you might notice by looking at the map is there's not a lot of conserved lands directly abutting Pettingill Stream. However, Midcoast Maine is hoping to change that. We have 2 really exciting projects that are planned to close this year. And so we have a conservation easement. This is land that stays in private hands, but Midcoast Conservancy holds certain restrictions like developmental rights to the land in perpetuity. And then we also have a fee acquisition property, which is just a fancy land trust term for land that Midcoast Conservancy will then own. What's really exciting about these projects is we have one easement on Pettingill Stream already, but with the addition of these 2 conservation projects, we'll be adding over 10,000 feet of shoreline protection on Pettingill Swamp, which is just really, really exciting. I'm going to focus in on this new acquisition. We're calling it Guinea Ridge. It's on the Guinea Ridge and goes to Pettingill Swamp. This is a 360-acre area with over 100 acres of mapped wetlands, some of that being the unpatterned fen that I talked about earlier. This is a really important area for wild waterfowl habitat, as well as deer wintering habitat. And this area is in an undeveloped habitat block that's around 6,000 acres. And what you can see here is you have the Nature Conservancy's property to the north and that pink Georges River property to the east, and they're not connected. But as you can see by this map, once this conservation project is completed, those properties will be contiguous. They'll be connected and protected over 2,000 acres that will allow for more ecological resiliency as climate change and allow for wildlife to be able to move through different habitats. Midcoast Conservancy has an algorithm that we use to kind of score different properties and different projects we're looking at. And this is one of our highest scoring properties we've ever had. So once Midcoast Conservancy acquires the land, what do we do with it? We steward it. So one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to put up these Midcoast Conservancy public access signs, because I know when I put up that sign and we complete these projects, we are creating access not only for the wildlife and the ecological integrity of the area, but also access for us people and communities, places where people can go hunting, fishing, foraging, do agriculture, as well as research. So there's several entities that have used Midcoast Conservancy lands and our public access to conduct research. The Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens conducted some native plant research earlier this year. The University of Maine conducted some spruce tree research last year on our Martins Point Preserve. So Isabel was talking about how these more northern boreal species are shifting as climate shifts. And so the University of Maine is trying to see how these spruce trees are responding to those climatic changes. And they're able to use Midcoast Conservancy land to be a part of their research. We also have the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, the CDC, and the United States Geological Survey, all using this land to help access for research on projects that they're looking into. Another big thing that our lands are used for is recreation. So here in the Midcoast Conservancy, we have over 21 public hiking preserves with 70 miles worth of trails across 13 different towns, which is pretty incredible that we're able to provide this much access for our communities to connect with nature. Here in the Medomak region, we have 11 hiking preserves with 20 miles worth of trail. Now that's a lot of miles worth of trail. That's all the way from here in Waldoboro to all the way to Camden. So it's pretty significant. And the way that all these trails get maintained and kept up is with our Medomak Valley Trail Crew. This is just like another one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to work with this amazing group of folks. April to October, we're out there almost every Wednesday at 9 a.m. tending to the trails and making sure they're safe and accessible for everyone. Here are some photos of the fun that we have out there. And I asked some of the crew what they loved about being a part of this work that we do. And a lot of them first focused on how great the people are in this group. So it's a really diverse group of folks. We all bring a little bit of different knowledge that we love to share and teach each other. And also just the sense of giving back to the community. You know, these people are doing really hard work that allows for everyone to be able to access these trails. One really cool project that we worked on this summer was up at our Burkett Mill Preserve. If you look at this photo in the upper left, you mostly are going to see trees. You might be able to see some very large rocks behind them. So a glacial erratic is just a really large boulder that got dropped off by the glaciers. And there's really a beautiful specimens at the Burkett Mill Preserve. However, you couldn't really see them because of all the tree growth that was surrounding them. So I called in our incredible trail crew, and they came out with all their expertise and tools, took down a bunch of trees, and opened up these incredible glacial erratics. So thank you, Medomak Valley Trail Crew, for all that you do. We appreciate all your hard work so much. And to show this appreciation, I would like to now talk about our 2025 Medomak Valley Volunteer of the Year, which is James. Whee! So thank you, James, so much. James is one of the first people there at Trail Crew every day and one of the last to leave. He always makes sure everything is good and safe and looking sharp before he departs. James also has like every tool available that you could think of and also knows how to use them. So we're just so grateful for him showing up every Wednesday. He goes out and does projects on his own. He's always letting us know how the trails are out there. So we couldn't do this work without you, James. Thank you so much. So to wrap up, our climate and communities are changing, and we all need to work together to keep our watershed connected and diverse. So one really easy thing that you can do is to rewild your lawn. So refrain from spraying weed killer fertilizer or pesticides. These run off into groundwater or a stream or lake or ocean if you're on the water. And if you are on the water, it's really a good idea to plant a riparian buffer. So some plant life that's between your home and the water. This helps prevent nutrient runoff and sediment and erosion from going into those water bodies. And Midcoast Conservancy has ways to support you on these endeavors, so feel free to reach out. And how you can support Midcoast Conservancy, you can volunteer. We rely on volunteer captains to get us out on the water to collect that really important water quality data. Our trail crew, which I highlighted earlier, we also lead educational walks for the community. So if you have anything you're passionate about, whether that's birds, trees, geology, lichens, mosses, feel free to reach out and spread your knowledge. Also, you can become a member of Midcoast Conservancy. This is where a lot of our support comes from. Becoming a member, you get our annual or biannual newsletter, a reduced cost for the programs that we put on, and best of all, you just get to support all the amazing work that we do. And while we all love our jobs, we do need money to get all of this work done. And so always donating is really helpful. We're still fundraising to close the gap for our Guinea Ridge acquisition and our Herbie Hill easement. So if you're interested in helping support those projects, please reach out. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming here tonight and watching this talk. And thank you to all of our volunteers that make this work possible. And to the Waldo Theatre for hosting this talk, as well as to these local businesses for our door prizes. So we have some beautiful clay artwork pieces from Fish in the Garden. We have gift certificates to Ida's Garden Bar, the Narrows Tavern, Catbird Flower Farm, and Perch Cafe and Bakery. So thank you to our amazing community. Thank you to you, and enjoy.